"Take your hands from my bride," Montague said, and the torn lace slipped from Rosalind Prescott's fingers. Genevieve Quincy stood before St. Anselm's altar with half her mother's wedding veil hanging ruined against her shoulder, while every guest in the pews waited to see whether the Duke of Inglefield had come to save a marriage or end it. Montague did not look at the torn silk first. He looked at Genevieve's lifted chin. That was what silenced the chapel. The silence was absolute. It tasted of cold stone candle smoke and held breath. Rosalind Prescott stood a little breathless beside the altar rail, the ripped edge of point d'esprit lace still trapped beneath her pale glove. Lady Prescott stood at her daughter's shoulder with a bright, ugly triumph in her eyes. They had come to prove that Genevieve was a substitute, a poor companion drawn from the shadows because Rosalind had broken her own engagement by letter, then returned too late to their being replaced. Genevieve did not weep. She did not cover her face. She reached up her fingers steady and gathered the ruined veil against her collarbone. The lace was weightless, but the shame in the room was heavy enough to bow a stronger woman. She held it anyway. She would not let the Prescotts see her bend. Montague, Duke of Inglefield, walked down the center aisle in black formal dress. He did not hurry. His footsteps struck the flagstones with the measured, terrible cadence of a man who required no one's permission to enter any room in England. He did not look at the Prescotts. He did not answer the whispers. He stopped before the altar. Rosalind took half a step forward, her practiced smile trembling at the edges. She expected him to demand an explanation from her. She expected the reprimand that came before forgiveness. The rightful bride, retreating the groom, following the poor companion, dismissed like an error in a ledger. He looked entirely past her. "Rector Otterline," his voice flat and clear. Montague said, "You will pause the ceremony. No one is to move from the pews until Miss Quincy has left the aisle." It was not tenderness. It was an order, cold enough to frost the stained glass. Genevieve felt the chill of it settle against her skin. He was protecting the dignity of his house, she told herself. Not her. A duke could not have a brawl at his altar. She was merely the wreckage left on his marble floor. Rosalind's smile faltered. "Your Grace," she began, "I only meant to stop a farce. You cannot truly mean to marry a woman taken up in panic." "I did not ask for your voice, Miss Prescott." Montague did not raise his tone. He did not have to. Rosalind flushed crimson. She spun, gathered her skirts, and swept toward the vestry, fully expecting the heavy tread of the Duke to follow. The proper bride withdrew so that the groom might chase. Montague did not move. He let the vestry door click shut. Then he turned to Genevieve. He offered his arm. He did not apologize for the torn lace. He did not give her the insult of pity. He merely extended his arm, rigid and proper, in front of 200 staring eyes. "Do you wish to continue postpone, or leave, Miss Quincy?" he asked. The question struck her harder than the tearing of the veil. For the past 4 days, families had spoken over her head. She had been praised for being sensible, pressed for being useful, dressed because the license could be made proper and the alliance still saved. She had been pushed toward a carriage, toward a church, toward a life everyone else had arranged in fear of scandal. No one had asked what she wished. She looked at his arm, then at his face. The Duke of Inglefield was a man carved from winter, a widower who had buried his heart 5 years before and kept the grave locked. There was no pity in his dark eyes, only waiting. If she fled, the torn veil would be the whole story. The county would remember the ruined companion running from the side door. "Postpone," Genevieve said. Her voice did not shake. Montague gave one curt nod. Then we postpone. He did not explain himself to the pews. He escorted her down the aisle. Their steps matched, while the congregation stayed trapped in place by the sheer force of his command. She was not running. She was being escorted. There was a difference. And yet, as the carriage carried them toward Inglefield Manor, the question remained lodged beneath Genevieve's ribs. Why had he come back for the wrong bride, with a face that said she had never been wrong to him? At Inglefield Manor, the postponed wedding became a household siege. Genevieve was given a guest chamber in the east wing and treated by the staff with a politeness so careful it cut. The maids laid out fresh water and would not meet her eyes. The footman opened doors before she reached them, then vanished as if her disgrace might brush their coats. She was the woman who had almost been Duchess and was now entirely nothing. The family was not so careful. "It is a disaster of the first water," Montague Ignatius Aldridge's voice carried from the library that afternoon. The Duke's cousin and adviser paced hard enough for Genevieve to hear the carpet take each turn. Rosalind made her point poorly, but she made it. "The county knows the Quincy girl was a panic measure. Send her away quietly. Pension her. We open negotiations with the Prescotts. A duke cannot afford a chapel scandal over a companion." Genevieve paused in the corridor with a stack of folded linen in her arms. Habit made her step back into the shadow of a half-open door. Surviving in great houses was a quiet business. You learned where floorboards complained. You learned when silence protected you better than any answer. "I will not reopen negotiations," Montague replied. His voice was clipped, devoid of heat. "Be reasonable. The Prescott lands touch yours for 7 miles. The alliance is severed." "Because of Miss Quincy?" "Montague, she is suitable for the background, not the head of the table. You cannot keep her here. She remains at Inglefield as long as she chooses to remain." It was a defense, but it sounded like policy. Genevieve closed her eyes. She told herself not to mistake decency for wanting. He was a man who hated disorder. She was a complication he had elected to manage. Being kept because sending her away looked cruel was not the same as being chosen. She carried the linen to the west wing herself. The linen room was narrow and plain, smelling of lavender starch and dried rosemary. Shelves rose to the ceiling. A small work table stood beneath the window, honest and scarred by years of use. It was the safest room in the house, because no one important wished to remain there long. Genevieve opened the wooden box she had carried from the chapel. Inside lay the torn veil. It was point d'esprit lace, worked by her mother's hands, the last pattern finished before fever took the strength from those fingers. Genevieve had designed the border when she was 17, copying little sprays of myrtle from the rectory garden. It was not grand enough for a duchess. It was intricate, humble, and fiercely guarded. It was the only inheritance she possessed. Now a jagged rip ran through the central motif. Genevieve sat at the table. She threaded a fine needle with silk. She did not weep. Tears changed nothing. She aligned the torn edges, counted the broken threads, and began. The needle pierced the lace. A sharp sting bit her index finger. A bead of dark red welled against her skin. She wiped it on the inside of her cuff and pulled the thread tight. The door opened. Montague stood in the threshold. His shoulders filled the frame, casting a long shadow across the cutting table. He wore no cravat, his collar open, looking less like a duke and more like a tired soldier who had forgotten the war was over. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the needle. He looked at the lace. He looked at the small box beside her, where the remaining torn pieces lay sorted by size. "You are repairing it," he said. "It is my mother's pattern, Your Grace." Genevieve kept her voice low. "I do not waste good thread." He stepped farther into the room. He did not offer the easy apology that would have required nothing of him. He looked down at her hands instead. He saw the smear of blood on the white silk. He went perfectly still. Genevieve closed her fingers at once, hiding the cut. "It is nothing." Montague said nothing. He reached into his coat, withdrew a folded linen handkerchief, and laid it on the table beside her wounded hand. He did not press it into her fingers. He did not command her to use it. He simply placed the clean cloth within reach, then turned and walked out. Of course, a duke did not linger in a linen room. 10 minutes later, a silent maid appeared with a small jar of arnica salve, a clean linen bandage, and a silver thimble on a folded napkin. The maid curtsied. "His Grace instructed that no one in the manor is to touch your veil, ma'am, not without your express permission." Genevieve stared at the handkerchief first, then at the little jar, then at the thimble, plain and practical, almost certainly taken from some household workbox and polished in haste. He had noticed the blood. He had noticed she was not crying. It was a terrifying thing to be seen by a man who claimed to look at nothing. By the end of that week, Rosalind had installed herself at the Swan Inn and fed the county a tidier story. The poor companion had trapped the grieving Duke through convenience. The torn veil had revealed what everyone already knew. The proper bride had merely tried to spare an old family from disgrace. Genevieve ignored it. She kept her voice even. She answered only when asked. Each morning she went to the parish rooms to repair the heavy altar cloths Rector Ottoline's housekeeper had been too stiff-fingered to mend. Her hands knew the geography of damaged things. Work was the only dignity still entirely under her command. Montague watched her. He saw her cross the great hall without shrinking. He saw the footman glance at the torn workbox she carried and lower their eyes first. He saw her accept tea from a maid who trembled with curiosity, thank the girl as if nothing in the world had been lost, and leave the tray arranged neater than she found it. She did not perform her hurt. She did not seek allies in his household. She asked for nothing. That unsettled him more than tears would have done. He had married Eleanor out of duty and buried her in grief. Since then, he had treated warmth as a betrayal of the dead. The Prescott match had been safe because it required no heart. Rosalind wanted rank. He needed heirs. It was a transaction, and transactions did not wake a man at midnight with guilt in his throat. But watching Genevieve Quincy thread a needle with a bleeding finger was not safe. On Thursday afternoon, Genevieve walked through the West Gallery, carrying a basket of mended linen. The long room was cold, despite the spring light. Most of the portraits had been covered after Eleanor's death, veiled in dark cloth, until the whole gallery resembled a corridor of mourning. A draught from the tall windows caught one velvet drape and pulled it back. A painted face appeared. Eleanor. Pale, gentle, smiling softly in a gown of blue silk. Genevieve stopped. She did not study the portrait with jealousy. She did not turn away as if the dead woman were a rival. She only stood there, holding the basket against her waist, and looked at the face of the woman whose absence still governed every room. Then she set the basket down. With careful hands, she drew the velvet back over the portrait and secured the cord so the draught would not uncover it again. It was a small gesture. It undid him. At the far end of the gallery, Montague stood in the shadow of an archway. A sharp ache opened in his chest, like ice cracking over black water. She was not competing with a ghost. She had protected a grief that was not hers. An hour later, Ignatius found him in the study. "Rosalind is threatening to attend Sunday service," he warned. "She intends to make a spectacle. She claims Miss Quincy has been wearing Eleanor's jewels in secret. Montague looked up from his ledger. His face remained a mask of stone, but his eyes were black iron. "No one," he said, his voice dropping to a lethal quiet, "is to speak my late wife's name as a weapon against Miss Quincy. If Miss Prescott attempts it under my roof or in my parish, she will find every door of Inglefield closed to her." Ignatius stared. "You cannot close a parish church." "No," Montague said, "but I can close my house, my table, my credit, and my acquaintance. See that she understands the distinction." Ignatius bowed and backed out. Montague returned to the ledger and read the same line 6 times, without understanding a word. That evening, Montague found Genevieve in the library. She sat beneath a single oil lamp with an estate account book open before her. The repaired altar cloth lay folded in a basket at her feet. Her hair had loosened at her temples. The little silver thimble sat beside her hand. He stood by the hearth, though no fire had been laid. He owed her the truth. The silence between them had become too heavy to pass for restraint. "My family decided I must remarry," he said abruptly. Genevieve did not startle. "Most families decide such things for men with titles." "They chose Rosalind. She was suitable. She wanted the rank, and I wanted a wife who would not require." He stopped. The sentence had teeth. "A wife who would not require you to love her," Genevieve said. She did not look up from the ledger. Montague's jaw tightened. "I believed duty was safer than affection. I believed a quiet arrangement was the only honorable path." Genevieve closed the book. The sound was soft, but it ended something. When she turned her head, her silence had depth. She did not pity him. She did not offer him absolution because he had finally named his cowardice in more respectable words. "A house can be full of duty, Your Grace," she said, "and still starve a woman." The words struck him like a blow. Eleanor had not lacked gowns, jewels, doctors, carriages, fires, or servants. She had lacked a husband who knew how to sit beside her without turning tenderness into obligation. He had provided for her until the house gleamed with provision, and still the rooms had been cold. He had been prepared to do the same to another woman and call it honor. Montague walked slowly toward the table. The torn veil rested in its open box beside the account book. Genevieve had repaired a hand's breadth of the damage, leaving the broken edges visible until the next row of stitches could draw them together. He stopped beside her. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled the leather glove from his right hand and laid it on the table. His bare fingers hovered above the lace. "May I?" he asked. His voice was rough. Genevieve's breath caught. She nodded once. He touched the edge of the veil, as if it were not a ruined article, not evidence of a scandal, but something living. His thumb brushed the small, precise stitches she had made. He did not touch the blood mark. "It is strong," he said quietly. "It has to be." He looked from the lace to her eyes. For once, the cold discipline in his face did not conceal him quickly enough. She saw exhaustion there, regret, fear too carefully trained to stand still. "Rosalind has sent word," he said. "She intends to come to St. Anselm's on Sunday. She calls it a blessing. She means a trial." Genevieve's hands tightened in her lap. Sunday would be a public execution if she allowed it. The veil would be held up as proof. Every whisper would be given a pulpit. Montague's hand remained beside the lace, not touching hers. "I will not permit her to lay hands on you again." "No," Genevieve said. His eyes lifted. She swallowed once.
You may stop her hand, but you cannot stop her meaning unless I stop being ashamed of the cloth."
He was silent for a long moment. Then he bowed his head very slightly, as if she had given him an order he intended to obey. The next morning, the air in the old yew walk was sharp enough to sting. The trees formed a dark, tunneling canopy above the gravel path. Genevieve walked with her gloved hands clasped at her waist. Montague kept his behind his back, the picture of control. Only the set of his mouth betrayed him. "Ignatius believes you should be sent to London until the scandal fades," he said. Genevieve kept her eyes on the gravel.
"And what do you believe, Your Grace?"
"I believe you have endured enough insult." He stopped and turned to her. "I have arranged a settlement. It is substantial. You may leave Inglefield today with independence. No one would dictate your position again." It was meant as respect. It landed like dismissal. Genevieve looked at him. The settlement was an escape wrapped in generosity, a way to remove the awkward woman from view before his life became impossible, a way to keep his name clean and his heart untouched. The lock on her silence broke.
"I am tired,"
she said. The words were not loud. That made them sharper. Montague went still. "I am tired of being the woman people use when the first choice has gone. I am tired of being thanked for my sense when sense only means I must want less than everyone else. I am tired of being the quiet arrangement." He stepped toward her.
"Genevieve, I do not think of you as... You think of me as a responsibility."
She looked straight into his dark eyes and did not allow him the mercy of looking away.
"You offer me money, so you do not have to offer a choice. You hide behind grief because it is easier than living."
His face hardened. "You do not know what my grief is."
"I know what it is made of you."
She stepped closer, her voice dropping.
"You did not betray the dead by wanting warmth, Montague. You betrayed yourself by calling loneliness loyalty."
The truth stood between them, bare and unforgiving. He saw her then. Not as a scandal, not as a duty, not as a woman whose dignity he could protect from a distance, but as someone exhausted from standing upright entirely alone. And she saw him. Not the Duke carved from winter, but the terrified man beneath him, afraid that choosing her would confess how empty his old loyalty had become. His control faltered. He reached out. His hand closed around her upper arm, not painfully, but with a desperation that startled them both. An anchor, a plea he had not learned how to speak. For one breath, the world narrowed to the heat of his palm through her wool spencer. Then Montague seemed to hear his own breath. His hand loosened before she could draw away. He stepped back half a pace, his jaw tightening, as if the movement cost him more than the touch itself. No one had interrupted them. No servant had appeared. He released her because the need in his own hand had frightened him. Genevieve felt the absence at once. It was colder than the morning air. Montague looked at her as though he had found the edge of a precipice beneath his boots. "I have lived too long by making every decent thing look like duty," he said. The admission was low, almost harsh. Genevieve did not answer. She could not. If she spoke, the careful wall inside her might open. He drew himself back into stillness, but the wall no longer fit him cleanly. The question hung in the cold air between them. Sunday was coming. Saturday night, Inglefield Manor held its breath. Rosalind arrived, without invitation, bringing Lady Prescott and 2 trunks too many for a woman who claimed she had come only to speak. She pushed her way into the drawing room with the confidence of someone who still believed embarrassment was a weapon sharpened for other people. Genevieve stood in the shadowed hall beyond the half-open door. She should have gone upstairs. She knew that. But old training held her in place. A companion survived by knowing what powerful people decided before they decided it aloud. "You acted from shock, Montague," Rosalind said, her voice softened into a practiced purr. "The county knows it. The torn veil proves the whole chapel saw her as a substitute. If you marry her, you marry the joke." Lady Prescott murmured approval. Rosalind continued, each word polished. "Marry me privately tomorrow. Pension, Miss Quincy. Let the county forget this unfortunate week." Ignatius spoke next. "It is the cleaner solution, Your Grace. The most sensible alliance." Clean. Sensible. Words used to sweep living women out of sight. Genevieve did not wait for Montague's answer. If he chose her only when every other path is more difficult, the choice would still feel like charity. If he chose Rosalind, Genevieve would not be found standing in a corridor with her heart exposed like torn lace. She turned and walked silently to the east wing. She packed one plain travelling case. The folded veil went in last. She laid it on top, visible seam, unfinished, broken border, wrapped in tissue. Leaving before dawn would protect his name. It would give him the cleaner solution. It was the sensible thing. She sat on the edge of the bed until the candle guttered. At 4 a.m, the manor was black and cold. Genevieve slipped down the servant's stair, carrying the case in one hand and her cloak in the other. The mail coach passed the lower gates before sunrise. If she reached it, there would be no scene. No chase, no chapel. She opened the heavy oak side door. Cold air rushed in. Montague stood on the stone terrace. He wore a heavy riding coat. His hair was disordered by wind. He looked as though he had not slept. He did not seem surprised to see the case in her hand. Genevieve froze. "I am leaving, Your Grace. It is better for the house." He did not seize her arm. He did not block the steps. The gravel drive lay open behind him, pale under the last of the moon. "Is it better for you?" he asked. "It prevents scandal. It gives you an honourable exit." "I did not ask about my exit." His voice was low, scraped raw by the dark. "I asked about you." Genevieve gripped the handle until it hurt. "If I stay, Rosalind will stand in that chapel and make my veil proof that I am nothing but a shadow. I will not be a shadow." Montague stepped forward once. "No more." "Then do not be one." She looked up. His face was pale in the pre-dawn light, but his gaze did not waver. "Do you want them to remember you running or standing?" The question was not a rescue. He had left the road open. He was asking her to choose her own ground. Genevieve looked past him to the dark drive. London waited somewhere beyond it. Safety, anonymity, a life that would be hers because it would ask nothing of her. Then she looked at the man who had removed his glove before touching her ruined lace. Slowly, she lowered the travelling case to the stone floor. "I will stand," she said. Montague's eyes closed for the space of one breath. When he opened them, the Duke was there again. But something warmer stood behind him now, unhidden. "Then I will stand where you can see me," he said. "Not in front of you." The carriage to St. Anselm's felt longer than the road itself. Genevieve sat with the repaired veil folded in her lap, one thumb pressed against the visible seam. Fear rode with her cold and close, but it no longer held the reins. Sunday morning, St. Anselm's Chapel was packed to the rafters. The air smelled of damp wool, beeswax, and eager cruelty. Farmers stood at the back. Gentry filled every pew. Even those who had despised scandal yesterday had risen early to witness it today. Rosalind sat in the front pew, in pale gold, her bonnet trimmed with white roses, meant to look bridal without quite admitting the intention. Lady Prescott sat beside her like a loaded pistol. They expected a correction. They expected a frightened companion. They expected the Duke of Inglefield to restore order. The heavy chapel doors opened. Genevieve walked in. A collective gasp moved through the pews. She was not wearing a Sunday walking dress. She wore the white gown. Pinned to her hair was her mother's torn veil. It was not fully repaired. She had mended the longest tear, but she had not hidden the damage. A visible seam ran down the right side, fine and stark, like a pale scar. 2 small breaks at the border remained open, where Rosalind's grip had mangled the mesh beyond any invisible repair. Genevieve wore it like armor. Whispers rose at once. Rosalind stood, outrage breaking through her smile. Lady Prescott lifted one hand to point. Then the side door of the vestry opened. Montague stepped out. He wore black. His face was granite. He came to the center of the altar, looked at the murmuring crowd, and raised one hand. The chapel fell silent, exactly as it had days before. The echo of "Take your hands from my bride" seemed to hang in every rafter. But this time, Montague did not speak first. He looked at Genevieve. He waited. Genevieve stepped forward. She did not look at Rosalind. She walked to the altar rail. With steady, unhurried hands, she unpinned the veil from her hair and laid the white lace across the polished wood. The visible seam caught the morning light. Then she turned, not to the congregation first, but to Montague. "I will not be married as a substitute," she said. Her voice was not loud. It carried because the room had grown afraid to breathe. "I will not be hidden as a compromise, or kept as an apology for a broken arrangement. If I am to marry, I will be named and chosen as myself." She had laid her damage out for God and the county to see. She had refused to be ashamed of it. Only then did Montague move. The frozen exterior did not crack. It vanished. He turned to face the congregation. He looked directly at Rosalind Prescott, then at Lady Prescott, then at Ignatius. Last, his gaze passed over every crowded pew that had come hungry for humiliation. "Miss Prescott was never robbed of a groom," Montague said. His voice carried the full, crushing weight of his title. "She abandoned a bargain I had already come to despise." Rosalind paled. "I was a coward," he continued. The chapel seemed to recoil from the word. "I thought a cold marriage would harm no one if both parties understood the terms. I was wrong. A house can be full of duty and still starve a woman." Genevieve's breath caught. He had taken her words into the center of the chapel and given them back without stealing them. Montague turned to her then. He stepped down from the altar, step closing the distance between them. In front of the county, he offered his bare hand. Not gloved. Bare. "I name Genevieve Quincy as the woman I choose," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "Before God, before my family, and before this county, she is not a replacement. She is my first and only choice." Rosalind tried to laugh. The sound was thin, desperate, meant to dismiss the moment as theatre. No one joined her. Lady Prescott's hand closed hard around her daughter's wrist. The white roses on Rosalind's bonnet quivered as she looked from pew to pew, waiting for one familiar face to smile back.
No one did. Even Ignatius lowered his eyes first. Genevieve looked at Montague's hand. He had not taken hers. He had offered. The whole room waited to see whether she would accept the victory he had brought to her feet. She did not accept it as a gift. She chose it. Genevieve placed her hand in his and turned her fingers through his. The seam of the veil gleamed beside them on the altar rail. "I choose to stand here," she said. Montague's grip tightened once. Not possession. Answer.
The wedding that followed 10 minutes later was smaller, because half the Prescotts fled to their carriages and the other half remained, only because leaving would admit defeat. But it was no longer secretive. Rector Otterline's hands shook as he opened the register. He recorded her by her full name, dipping the quill twice to make the ink dark. Genevieve Quincy. Not an alteration, not a correction whispered over a stain. The true bride. When she signed, her hand did not tremble. Montague signed beneath her. For a moment, his sleeve brushed hers. That small contact carried more warmth than all the candles in the chapel. Maxwell Garrow, the quiet estate steward, stepped forward to hand the Duke the blotting paper. He hesitated, glanced once at Genevieve, and bowed. "If I may, Your Grace," Garrow murmured, though the front pew could hear him. "Mrs. Inglefield ought to know. His Grace sent a rider to my office 3 hours before Miss Prescott came to the chapel. The instructions were clear. If Miss Prescott returned, the Prescott arrangement was to be formally ended. The revised license, naming Miss Quincy, had already been requested." Genevieve looked up, startled. Montague did not look embarrassed, but his jaw tightened. He had already begun choosing differently before Rosalind tore the lace, before the county watched, before anyone gave him permission. He looked down at Genevieve. "I did not want a safe life," he said softly. "I wanted you. I was simply too late in learning how to say it." Genevieve looked at the torn veil on the altar rail, then at the man beside her. "No," she said quietly enough for only him. "You said it in time." Outside the chapel, bells began to ring. They did not sound like rescue. They sounded like arrival. 6 months later, the West Gallery of Inglefield Manor no longer held covered portraits. The velvet drapes had been folded away. Eleanor's portrait remained in its place, clean and honored in the afternoon light. Beneath it, long oak tables filled the room, where mourning had once kept the windows dim. 10 women sat at those tables, widows, dismissed, companions, daughters without dowries, women who had been told in one way or another that they were useful only when unseen. Their hands moved swiftly over fine thread bobbins, mesh, and pinned patterns. Laughter did not fill the room loudly, but it lived there now, low and steady. Genevieve walked among them, correcting a stitch here, offering a quiet word of praise there. She had opened the lace room with money that was hers by marriage, and will that had always been hers. It was not charity. Every woman was paid for her work. Every pattern was signed by the hand that made it. The heavy doors opened. Montague entered, carrying a flat cedar box. The women did not flinch. No one hid their work. The Duke of Inglefield was a frequent, quiet presence in the gallery, known for setting down parcels without speeches, and for moving chairs when a draught troubled the older workers' hands. He came to the head table and placed the box before Genevieve. "What have you done?" she asked. "Asked permission," he replied. That almost made her smile before she opened it. Inside lay the wedding veil. She had finished the repairs herself. She had not replaced the torn section with new mesh. She had stitched the broken edges together
and left a fine, visible seam down the right side. Hidden damage was still damage. Healed cloth need not pretend it had never been torn. Montague stood beside her, his arm brushing hers. Not in front of her, beside her. "May it remain here?" he asked, his voice meant only for her. "As the first pattern."
Genevieve looked at the seam, then at Eleanor's uncovered portrait, then at the women bending over their own work, building wages, skill, and futures from thread fine enough to break and strong enough to hold. At last, she looked at Montague.
"Yes," she said.
She lifted one hand and traced the raised line of stitches with the tip of her finger. The seam caught the afternoon light and held.